Talk about environmentalism now. Environmentalism was a storied but weak movement. We can think all the way back through my course here to John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt establishing the national or expanding the national park system, and some individual incidents like the Hetch Hetchy Valley or the Green River. But in reality, the environmentalist movement up to this point had rarely ever wielded much political power. But in the 1960s, it will kind of catch fire and move to the forefront of the American mind. And this is really caused by two things. One is the development of the science of ecology, a far, far more complex and involved understanding of the environment itself. And the other is a series of just absolute ecological disasters. Conservationists had originally, like Muir and Roosevelt and these guys, had based their ideas on morality and beauty. Even going back to, say, Ralph Waldo Emerson. The idea was simply, this is really nice, we shouldn't screw it up. There was also spirituality to it. Particularly the Transcendentalist had believed this was God's finest work, and we shouldn't ruin these things. But by the time we get to the 1960s, there's a new concept, an idea that we're all related, that there's an interrelatedness of the natural world. Ideas like pollution, deforestation, extinction, and toxic waste. We began to understand that these were all going to have impacts on us. That they weren't just, oh, well, now the countryside isn't pretty anymore. It was actually going to change our lives. These concepts are really first put forward by the forester Aldo Leopold in 1949 in the Sand County Almanac. And he argues that people have a responsibility to the environment, and treating the environment poorly is going to have long-term consequences for us. He introduces some new ideas that I think most people understand pretty well today. The food chain, ecosystems, biodiversity, and endangered species, and the impact of losing an endangered species. These hadn't really been established in science yet. In 1962, Rachel Carson publishes a book called Silent Spring, and it's really about the dangers of pesticides. Pesticides, it seemed like a miracle. They were wiping out mosquitoes, and they were preventing things like malaria and yellow fever. But she begins to argue that they're damaging our plants, and they're damaging things that are vital to us. And Silent Spring was a national sensation. It was a huge bestseller. From 1945 to 1960, there's actually a 300% increase in people studying ecology. And then that doubles again between 1960 to 1970. And in the 60s, it begins to be a common major in major universities. It's something you can go study and get a degree in. A major lobbying force will develop in the Sierra Club, as well as the Wilderness Society, the Audubon Society. I guess I don't have those. The ACLU will get involved in this, the League of Women Voters, the National Council of Churches, and even the AFL-CIO, the big union, joins in. And there begins to be this war between big business, who of course profit from damaging the environment in many circumstances, and environmentalists who feel that protecting the environment is a greater priority. At this point, if you're watching at home, I strongly encourage you to take a minute and listen to Big Yellow Taxi. You can Google it, it'll be there on YouTube. You can listen to Joni Mitchell's version or the Counting Crows version, which I really like, or even Bob Dylan's version. But it really is this wonderful moment where the understanding of the ecology and what it means to us breaks through into the mainstream, and a great song in its own right. Lady Bird Johnson takes this issue to heart. We're beginning to get into a period where first ladies will adopt an issue. In fact, Lady Bird's really the first one. And that will become their thing. And it'll usually be a non-controversial issue. And Lady Bird will promote beautification programs, primarily in Washington, D.C., and actually here in Austin, Texas, where I live. I see the fruits of Lady Bird's work all the time. She will encourage people to plant wildflowers and preserve trees, and she plants cherry blossoms all over D.C., which, from what I'm told by D.C. natives, turned D.C. from kind of being a dumpy swamp into a really beautiful place at certain times of the year. The counterculture also embraces this environmentalist movement. And of course, it's no surprise because ecological problems are everywhere. Water pollution is affecting every major city in the country. It's making the city smelly and ugly and and polluting our drinking water and things like this. And worst of all, the Cuyahoga River, which runs through Cleveland, keeps catching on fire. It catches on fire over and over and over again. And of course, this begins to make the news, and people begin to realize, well, wait, maybe we are doing some damage, and we need to do something about this. Another problem is smog. Smog levels are going through the roof, and the air is becoming bad for us. If you have any sort of respiratory problems, asthma, or small children or elderly people, they're having serious health consequences from the increasing levels of smog in major cities. Cities like L.A. and Denver becoming overrun with smog, and people are just coughing all the time, even the people who don't smoke, and pretty much everybody smoked back then. Another problem is oil spills. In 1969, an offshore California oil well blows up, and oils hit the beautiful beaches of California, and this becomes quite a scandal. Of course, we have the even bigger oil spill, the Exxon Valdez incident in 1989, that by now people understand that it's going to that spill had a major environmental impact up on the coast of Alaska, which we consider to be a precious wildlife refuge these days. And people began to freak out and worry about this. Of course, recently, a few years ago, we had the oil spill in the Gulf, the British petroleum oil spill, and now we're seeing mutated shrimp and dead zones out in the Gulf of Mexico. There begins to be discussions of things like renewable energy sources versus finite resources. Resources are going to run out. Acid rain becomes a reality. Rain that is being, precipitated up, that's probably not the right word, but is being evaporated up, into the clouds, and has chemicals in it because the water is filled with chemicals. And then it rains down, and it's toxic rain. It's not really acid. It doesn't eat your face off. But it's too acidic for plants to grow. So you think, oh, rain, good, my yard's going to do well. Well, if it's acid rain, it's actually going to kill your yard or your crops, more importantly. We begin to understand the importance of the rainforest to the world's ecology. We begin to realize that there's an ozone layer, and it is being depleted. And if it gets depleted too much, we're in a lot of trouble. Scientists also began charting the rising level of the oceans. In response to so many of these issues, on April 22nd of 1970, environmentalists declared the first Earth Day. 20 million people across the country show up to celebrate this. They attempt to be non-political. The ecology in the beginning was actually non-partisan. It was really kind of everybody versus polluting businesses. And it wasn't really associated with one party or the other. It will develop into a partisan issue later, where Democrats tending to be pro-environment and Republicans tending to argue that it inhibits business too much to protect the environment. But environmentalism certainly gets absorbed into the popular culture. Watch almost any Saturday morning cartoon, and you'll eventually run across an episode where they're protecting the environment, or Disney movies, it's very much in our culture on a day-to-day basis. In 1970, Richard Nixon, of all people, a conservative obviously, creates the Environmental Protection Agency, an agency designed to try to clean up pollution. And in 1970, Nixon signs into law the Clean Air Act, which actually does try to limit pollution in the air, unlike the later Clean Air Act, which does the opposite. In 1972, Nixon signs the Clean Water Act. Big businesses, though, are unhappy about this because what this is doing is putting rules on them, and those rules cost money, which means profits. And they will begin to fight back and begin to lobby, particularly Republican politicians, to try to do away with these regulations on pollution. And here's a little quote from one of the guys who founded Earth Day, Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin.